Hello and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down again with author Jason Voiovich, and we talk about his most recent book, Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress. It's an examination of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, as you were probably taught in school. And there's a lot of truth to that, but there's a lot more to the era, and I think it's a lot more important than it's often stressed. It's not just the pulp culture era of gangsters and rum runners and flappers. There's a lot more to it than that. And frankly, there's a lot more that's in our modern world that's come from the 20s than maybe that's come from the 1930s or even 1940s. So we're going to talk about this. Some of you may remember Mr. Voiovich. He's the author of Marketer in Chief. We talked about presidents maybe about a year and a half ago. One of my favorite historians to sit down with. We had a great time talking about this, and I'm sure you'll love the interview. And you know what? You'd love picking up the book too. Link is in the show notes. You can purchase it right now if you're interested, or listen to the interview and maybe then purchase it. Either way, it's your choice. But without further ado, my interview with Jason Voiovich, author of Booze, Babe Ruth, and The Little Black Dress. A moment ago in the introduction, sitting down today with author Jason Voiovich for the second time, talking this time about the Roaring Twenties. He's got a new book out, Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, and it's a very fitting title, and I want to ask you about it in a second. But before we get to even talking about that, I'm always fascinated with the 1920s, both in American history and in world history, because it's really forgotten in so many ways. And a big part of that, I think, is it gets sandwiched between, if we're talking about American history, we've got the progressive era, we've got Woodrow Wilson, and then on the other end of the side, of course, we've got FDR and the Great Depression. And it's also sandwiched between the world wars, if you look at it from a global perspective. And so a lot of times, I think, when you're teaching American history, people tend to go like, and then there was the 1920s, and there were flappers, and there were gangsters, and there was Prohibition, and there was that World Series close to almost 1920s that got rigged, and all those things. And, we ignore a lot of the importance of the era. And, I just wanted to start out by asking, because, you've done a deep dive into this era, and I'm just curious to think, like, what do you feel like we miss? What do you feel like we miss in terms of the significance to both American history and, if you want, even world history, if we just kind of pass this era by? Because I definitely think we're missing something.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm always fascinated by the things that people don't talk about. And I think there's so much insight to be gathered just by taking a look at what other people aren't, maybe in a new way. And part of it is my upbringing. I'm an ad man, as you know, and as your listeners may know. I've been in product development for the better part of 2.5 decades. And there are so many of those innovations that we know of in our field that kind of come from that era, that stem from that era. For instance, one particular example that kind of goes back to Woodrow Wilson, the Committee for Public Information, which essentially taught advertising people and public relations people how to sell war bonds in World War I. Well, after the war was over, all of those people needed something to do. And they ended up starting to work for the business community. The business community had never really leveraged advertising in that way before. They had never really invented mass marketing, mass advertising. Well, that was one of those kind of major trends that kind of came out of the war, kind of mass advertising. If you think that's about the same time that the Federal Reserve was created, and that the panics, kind of the early panics in the financial, the financial markets, and if you read the history of like J.P. Morgan of that era, that the era of the big bankers, that the government, needed to be involved in finance. So we had an era of mass finance. We already know about the Industrial Revolution in the area of mass production. All of those three trends came together in the 1920s. And, we had kind of mass production, mass finance, mass marketing, which created mass choice, mass consumer culture. And I think we forget about those things because, is it as dramatic as a world war? Is it as dramatic as the Great Depression? It's one of those things where there are really stories of kind of average people making choices for the first time, kind of learning how to make choices. And it's something, especially in American history and I would say in a lot of academic history, we tend to kind of poo-poo the kind of consumer history, business history. That's not something we tend to really focus on. Political history, military history. We don't really talk about business history that much in what I would say not in an Ida Tarbell sort of way. A robber baron sort of way. That's usually the most it gets. And I'm not sure that historians as a profession really have a good sense of it. They don't know how to think about it. They don't know how to talk about it. Not all of them, but they struggle with that. And I think that's why the real innovations of that era of the 1920s got ignored and looked past. They're viewed through a political lens where it's almost more useful to look at it through a consumer lens. You'd get more out of it that way if you look at it that way.
There's a couple of really important things in what you said there, but the thing I want to talk about first is we do this a lot in history, and it's frustrating to me that we really do tend to emphasize and put not necessarily the burden, but put on a pedestal political history, military history, things like that. We tend to say like, well, that's history, okay? And what frustrates me is cultural history is like somewhere in the basement behind, one of those boxes from the first Indiana Jones movie that they were moving all over the place, and being looked after by top men. And I think we lose a lot. I think we lose a lot when we say that cultural history doesn't count and that business history doesn't count. By the way, I agree with you. I think historians probably don't. I mean, historians didn't go to business school. Historians don't understand to a large extent how business functions. And so I do think there's a tendency to pull back from there, because you're absolutely right. If you're teaching U.S. history, if I bring up business, I bet most kids, most college students would say, robber barons, and that's kind of about it. That's kind of the only time that it really gets, we talk about horizontal integration and vertical integration and all that stuff, and trusts. A lot of talk about trust. And one topic that I thought was never going to come back, and that's a tariff. If you would have told me when I was in high school that, when you're in your late 30s, early 40s, you guys are going to be arguing about tariffs again, I'd say, are you insane? That is a relic of the 19th century that's never going to come back. And believe it or not, no, folks, this is why you got to learn about this stuff, because now we're talking about tariffs again. But I think that the 20s is so rich in cultural history. And especially, like, if you look at society today, and this is what I wanted to come back to with the advertising. Because if you think about, I like to teach the 20s because I think the 20s are the first time, from students' perspective, that America starts to look recognizable. For the first time, you look at New York and you look at the things that people are doing and you say, like, oh, okay, that kind of looks like what I think it looks like today. The past is no longer another planet. Once we start to get into the 20s, and I think advertising and consumer culture is a huge part of that, right? And the development of that consumer culture, I think, is so important to how the world is today. Maybe more important than the Great Depression in some ways. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think, when I think about the 1920s and all that, I've kind of gone in to learn about it, what you realize during the 1920s is that political history and military history take a bit of a backseat. This is the era of Calvin Coolidge, who was very much a non-interventionist. His philosophy was really via negativa, which essentially means I can't know what I'm supposed to do, so I'm going to be very cautious about how I act. In stark contrast to like a Hoover or a Teddy Roosevelt, or especially a Franklin Roosevelt, there were no major world wars during that time. We had just been out of one. Europe was a mess. That's not to say that there wasn't a Russian Revolution. There wasn't conflict going on. There certainly was. But as far as major conflicts the Americans were involved in, there weren't any during the 1920s. So you have this kind of bottoming out period, and this kind of speaks back to kind of what you were talking about. If there's nothing going on politically or militarily, it's like it didn't happen. But when you think about what was your life like as an average person, and I explain it very much the same way you do. I say, you know what, if we could go into a time machine and I took you back to 1928, you could get around as a typical American today. You'd go to the grocery store, you'd go to a big box store to buy things, you'd drive in a car, you'd go to a club, you'd listen to a radio. You wouldn't have the internet, but you would have Time magazine. You'd have a lot more media than you thought you did. There'd be all kinds of, you could pick up, dress the way you wanted to. The birth control was more widely available. This is a very modern, everyday experience for most people, most Americans, and let's be clear about that. It was tended to be a very democratizing sort of era. Contrary to kind of popular belief, the 1920s was about the most kind of equal era, one of the most equal eras in American history economically, where the gap between kind of the rich and the poor, people were generally doing better on the whole. That cut across racial and ethnic lines. Was it utopia? Certainly not, but it was very modern. If I got into that time machine and took you back to 1914, you wouldn't know where to start. Most people would have no idea what was going on. It would be completely foreign. So I think I thought of it the same way you did, that this is an important era to teach because it's the birth of modern American culture. The culture that most of us most of us aren't politicos. We're not military people. For most of our daily lives, we have a mortgage, we go shopping, we put our kids in school, we drive to vacation. All of those sorts of things were created. That culture was created during the 1920s. So when I think about that, it might be one of the most important eras to teach students today. Probably more important than a lot of the political and military history we teach them. This was really critical for their understanding about, this is what's the goal of history. It's to learn about what you do in the present. And without that kind of understanding, it's very difficult to move forward, in my opinion.
I think that's the problem with focusing on political history. First of all, it ignores the reality that for most people in a society, are not constantly focused on politics. Maybe more now than in the past, and that to an extent probably has a lot to do with media. But we went through a very long war in Afghanistan. If you didn't fight in it, and if you weren't a family member of somebody who fought in it, probably didn't affect you that much in reality. The fact of the matter is, cultural things are really, really important, because I agree with you. It's kind of like, this is what shapes America, especially when you think about the consumer culture that we still are very much a part of today. That would have been foreign to people before the 1920s. They wouldn't really have understood what that was. Is it, wait, I'm going to buy another shirt. I already have two shirts. Like, I'll just mend it. It's kind of a different mindset. And I think, to me, that's really where the rubber meets the road. It's your mindset. It's how you view the world. I think you go back to 1920, and the way that that humans there were starting to see America and American society would be somewhat similar to how we see it today. Whereas if you go back to 1910, you go back to 1900, it's a much harder time sort of breaking out of the way you think, the way you see the world. I talked with another historian on a different interview, and I still feel this is true. I think if you took someone from ancient Rome and you put him in the time machine and you brought him here today, I think they get used to the technology faster than they get used to the change in mentality. I think that they have a really difficult time understanding that, well, no, I mean, we don't do might makes right anymore. Like, that's not a thing that we do anymore, and you have to stop doing that. I think they have a harder time processing that than they do processing, this is a computer screen, you touch it and it'll play a video. I think a Roman probably figures that out within about 45 minutes. I don't think that that's a bridge too far for them, because kids do it now, older adults do it, it's not a problem. But it's that change in how you view the world that can be so jarring. And that's what we really start to see transform in the 1920s. And how we view the world and our relationship to economics and to the idea of being consumers changes in such a dramatic way. And one of the ways that is great in the book that obviously you talk about advertising, and I want to talk about advertising because I think it's really important for people to understand that it just simply wasn't a thing, really, before the 1920s. I'm not going to say that it didn't exist at all, because of course, people were reading newspapers and so on and so forth, but the notion of product placement and advertising and trying to understand your market, these are all very new things in the 1920s, and they really do revolutionize how we live, right?
Yeah, it's funny, when I think the mindset, and I want to step to that and kind of build from the mindset, because that's really where when you start to think about advertising and its impact, you have to start with that mindset that most people, when you think about, if you start to talk about the history of advertising, most people would tell you that, okay, advertisers or big business or big government really kind of they can control what you do. They have all of these techniques that they can kind of mollify consumers, and that we're kind of, like, we think we have choice, but we really don't, and we're just kind of slaves to their, to their whims and their tricks. What you discover, not only by reading the primary sources, but by just your own experience, is that that's not true. And I can tell you from being inside these organizations that both big and small, government, non-government, business, non-business, that the consumer is pretty much all powerful. Very difficult to predict. There are some things you can predict. There are some things you can work that might work for a little while, but other things that don't. And really, it was during the 1920s that advertising had to get a lot more sophisticated, because with mass production, you had a lot more things people could buy. People could afford them with different financing options, and people had so many choices. Just think about the experience of going into a store today. And I detail this story in kind of the opening of the book, where you just go and try to buy a coffee maker today. Go to Walmart, go to Target, go to Costco, whatever you want. Go buy a coffee maker. How many choices do you have? Probably at least a couple dozen choices. Back in 1905, you might have had one. You might have had two or three, maybe. But it was the 1920s where you started to get a lot of different choices to meet different consumer preferences. People thought, like, well, it's a way to get rid of excess capacity in the production. It was just all about inefficiency and waste. But really what you discover is that consumers demanded products and services that met their individual needs. They could choose between two, and businesses needed to respond to that. Production needed to respond, financing needed to respond, but most importantly, advertising needed to help talk to you about what those differences were so that you understood, why would I want a Buick versus a Chevrolet? Why would I want, this type of food versus that type of food? It was this dress versus that dress. Go to this, club versus that club. Listen to this radio program versus that radio program. Advertising needed to get very good at figuring out how to match product with need. And there were growing pains for sure, but this is the era where, if you start to read the advertisements from that time, they get sophisticated in a hurry. And they seem very, very modern. You look at advertisements from the 1890s, like at the Sears catalog, they look archaic because they are. You look at advertisements from 1925, especially advertisements for toys and targeted at children. You could transplant those to 1995, 2015 with very little change. Very, very little change, and they would be very modern. Which is just kind of an amazing thing to me that all of that was created during that time, yet how many history students really get that really understand their own culture? The culture that they walk out of the classroom and go back into, they don't understand it at all, which is fascinating to me. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book.
And that's really important because, again, these impact us today. And the other huge change, of course, that really starts to happen, 19 teens through 1920s is we have this huge economic boom. And to a large extent, it's driven by two things. You've got the automobile, and then you have electricity. Those are sort of the two big drivers, and it's always shocking to me when I talk to students and they're like, well, do they have electricity in 1880? I'm like, no. By and large, the answer is no. The infrastructure. Just think of the time and the investment that infrastructure takes to build. Once you start to generate electricity, that's what drives the economy to a large extent. Now you can use consumer goods in a way that you could never use before. You can have vacuum cleaners. You can have electric irons. You can have all of these. You can have radios. You can have all of these different things that you never had before. It's very similar to, you get to the late 80s and early 1990s, and the internet comes out, and that drives the economy again. So you sort of have these two huge catalysts going on at the same time. Electricity, in my opinion, is the big one. And then you have the automobile, which of course starts to become more and more and more popular as the 1920s goes on. And then you think about all of the tangential industries driven by this. Okay, we've got cars. All right, well, now we need mechanics. We didn't need those before. Well, now we need gas stations. We didn't need those before. Imagine taking a trip. You could take a trip in 1900 from New York to Los Angeles. First of all, it would have been on a train. All right. And second of all, you would have you would have gone the entire route. You never would have seen a gas station. Okay. You think of all the things that you wouldn't have seen. You probably wouldn't have seen money power lines. All right. These are, if you could take a trip during this time period, it's these economic changes that transform the American landscape completely, in ways that are really difficult to understand prior to then. It's hard for us to wrap our mind around American chattel slavery, of course. How could you own another person? That's seems like another world, but it also seems like another world not to have a vehicle and not to have the ability to turn on a light bulb. Which a lot of people, even in the 1930s, still aren't going to be able to do that in large parts of the United States. So these are huge changes that change the way they want. And then that fuels now there's products. And there's all these new products that we can sell people for the first time forever, and we've got to make the products, and mass production comes in, and that's where advertising goes into it. So it's these economic changes that are so critical to understanding the fabric of American life, and also life in the world in general. And those come about in the 1920s. I don't know, I guess there's not really a question here. I'm kind of just spitballing and thinking, like, how do we can even start to contextualize life before 1920, when we didn't have these things, and life in 1929 when they become so widespread?
It is so difficult to think of a world before that is almost inconceivable for people. And that's where I think in history you get a lot of the what you call anachronistic thinking, that kind of transplanting your current mindset onto someone who lived in 1880, someone who lived in the Roman Empire, someone who lived in ancient Persia, Mesopotamia, sub-Saharan Africa. It just doesn't make any sense. And to kind of put our modern mindset on them doesn't work. However, anachronistic thinking doesn't quite apply after 1920, because we tend to have a modern way to look at things at that time, which is really different. However, I find it's like sometimes people just can't get their head around the number of products on offer, but a lot of times it's the really surprising things. It's little things that just kind of blow you away. And there are a few of them I detail in the book that, for instance, grocery stores didn't exist, before the 1920s. Frozen food didn't exist. That kind of mass-produced frozen food was, really Clarence Birdseye's invention and innovation during that time. Like, to not be able to go buy frozen food. We think about, like, okay, well, that's interesting. That's kind of a neat product, but I bet we can kind of live without that. Or, but how do we think about, for instance, one of the really fascinating parts to me about the automobile was how the automobile was a critical catalyst for the South Florida land boom. We kind of think about, like, okay, well, where did, Miami in 1920 was a city of about, you could barely call it a city. It maybe had 5,000 people. It was basically a mosquito breeding facility. Key West, where the naval base was 10 times its size. And that was the big city down there. Miami wasn't. South Florida was just a swamp. But you had the ability, you kind of got people down there on roads. People realized that, wow, being in New York in the winter kind of sucks. And if we could go down to South Florida in the winter and it's sunny and we have bathing suits and, the Caribbean rum is a boat ride away, this looks pretty good. And you think about the entire South Florida planned community boom happened at about that time. And it was driven, it was the automobile was the catalyst of that. Road building was. One of the people who was kind of key to that was Carl Fisher, who, kind of created and kind of started the Indianapolis 500. So it was a very car-centric sort of thing. We wouldn't have had a Florida land boom in the 1920s had it not been for the automobile. Wouldn't have happened. Little things like that in terms of, like, why is there Miami today? Miami was created during the 1920s. It's little things like, oh, wow, you'd think, well, when was Miami founded? Like, well, probably it was Spanish hundreds of years ago and it just grew slowly. Nope. Miami was nothing until 1922, 1923. And then it grew exponentially and exploded. Miami Beach, Coral Gables, Naples, Fort Myers, Fort Lauderdale, you name it. All of that culture was created at that time. Just like crazy things that you just wouldn't think were connected to that were direct catalytic impacts of electricity, of the automobile, and of everything that kind of came along. It was just such a melting pot. When you think about what drives innovation, it's put enough catalyst, like it's kind of like making gumbo. It gets better the more stuff you put in it. And that was really amazing to me, that the 1920s was a decade where we just kept throwing peppers in the pot and saw what happened. It was just a crazy, chaotic time that we tend to gloss over.
Yeah,
and I don't think we should.
Technology just changes so many different things. And the 20s are one of those time periods where I almost like to think of it as like little explosions. And this explosion sets off this other explosion, and that one sets off that one. And they're just going off all over the place. A fun activity that I usually do with students is look at electoral college maps from 1900, from 1908. Look at how small Florida is. Look how few votes they have. Look how few votes California has. Southern California is nothing. Nobody lives there. You know, you're right. You're absolutely right about La Florida. The Spanish discover it. They don't really know what to do with it. They never really know what to do with it. You know, they formed St. August. They found St. Augustine, but that's about it. They make a couple of efforts to see, well, is there anybody here who has a lot of gold? No? Okay. Well, there's just a lot of mosquitoes and swamps. This isn't really the best place for us to be. We're going to go back to Cuba now. So and places like that, they kind of have to sit. And that's another one of those things where it's just so hard to wrap our mind around it, to tell people that, like, no. Miami's pretty new, actually. Los Angeles didn't used to be that big. Like, these are cities. Yes, New York has always been big. You know, New York has always been big. That's true. But some of the largest cities of the United States, I'm not even going to talk about Phoenix, have grown up relatively recently, and that has to do with technological changes that start in the 1920s and trickle down and flow down. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of mentality is the other thing that happens in the 1920s that starts to make America much more modern is sports. Sports starts to happen in the 1920s. Before the 1920s, you might have some regional boxing. You might have some horse racing here and there. Throughout most of the South, you'd have more rooster cockfighting than anything else, honestly. But the 1920s changes things because you get baseball, you get college football, and you get boxing in big stores, and you talk about that in the book. So let's talk about that for a little bit, and a lot of it's tied to the radio. So we gotta hook those again. Technology produces this capacity to disseminate sports for the first time, and that really changes a lot, doesn't it?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned radio and baseball, radio and boxing, and it's funny. Before the 1920s, you're right. Baseball had existed before then, but that was before the 1920s. You had what was called the dead ball era in baseball, where baseball was a very strategic, low-scoring game, lots of rules that kind of kept it low-scoring, and you had, when you first started to figure out that, okay, baseball could be a radio sport, but it had to be more exciting. And you had these kind of multiple things kind of coming at the same time. You had kind of the scandal of, the fixed World Series. You had the emergence of Babe Ruth as a power hitter. You had changes in the rules of the game to allow more hitting, more crack of the bat. And then you had the radio where you could begin to kind of talk about baseball in, it kind of drove all those things kind of catalyzed together to make baseball more of an exciting sport to hear about. And if you think about just the real basics of kind of listening to a baseball game, and it's actually still one of the most popular ways to consume baseball is on the radio, because it's still such an engaging radio sport. If you think about it for a second, okay, you get up to bat, and there's a lot of kind of drama between the pitcher and the hitter, right? The pitcher is kind of trying to kind of trick the batter, the catcher is trying to giving him signs. There isn't a lot of sound there. So the commentators, during that time, had a lot of dead air to fill, and on radio, dead air is dead air is a literal killer. People turn off the radio and they leave, and you'd never know it. It's not like people leave the stands. You could see if people left the stands at a baseball game. You can't know if your audience is leaving the radio. You can't see them. So what they needed to do is they needed to introduce color commentary. So between the kind of the dead air, there were two people. One person was kind of calling the balls and strikes and kind of calling the pitches. The other person was kind of creating commentary. That was the birth of kind of commentary in sports that made sports more engaging, more fun. It's how you could learn more about the players. And then you had this guy called Babe Ruth, who was tailor-made for talking about. He was just his lifestyle, bigger than life. It's funny, too, that the microphones during that era weren't as good about kind of keeping out crowd noise. So during the breaks, you'd have people screaming about cold beer. You'd have kind of the roar of the crowd, the crack of the bat. It really made you feel like you were there. So you could be a New York Yankees fan and live somewhere in Ohio and still follow your team and still feel like you were really there. And it catalyzed people who heard about the game on the radio and would listen to the game. Well, they wanted to go to actually see a live game. That was, kind of the innovation of the Wrigley's in Chicago to get people in, and it made, the Chicago Cubs got people, one of the biggest radio sports teams. They were really the pioneers, figured out that if you had radio on you had the Cubs on the radio, people would want to go to Wrigley Field. And they'd want to buy Wrigley's gum and all that sort of stuff. More sponsors wanted to be on the radio. It was just this, you kind of talk about these little explosions and these little like this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. Those are really the most fascinating stories. And that's really in the style of the book. That's why I focus the chapters on, smaller kind of, bite-sized pieces, because you have to draw those connections together. Otherwise, I read a lot of history and, especially organized chronologically, for instance. Your traditional history books kind of organized, this year, then this year, then this year. And they try to weave together multiple things that were happening. And as the reader, unless you know a lot about that particular era, it's really difficult as a casual reader to follow along. Like you kind of lose your place. I wanted to make sure people could really understand what led to baseball being what it is. This led to this, led to this, led to this, where you could kind of follow it along. It doesn't mean that there weren't other things happening during that time, but I want to write for people who don't usually read history. That's kind of my mission. And that's the 1920s is such a fascinating kind of era to help kind of really tease that out. So again, sports is fantastic. I don't talk a lot about boxing, but a little bit. College football, a little bit. And it's just such an amazing topic. I could keep going. The one thing I'll leave you with, though, before I hand it back to you, is okay. Well, what was the big driver for radio? People think they turn on the TV or the radio today, and there's always something on, right? Always something on. Most people don't realize that in the early days of radio, the radio might only be on a couple hours a day. There just wasn't a lot of programming. No one understood how to make programming for the radio and fill 24 hours. Most radio stations were on for little 15 to 1 hour blocks, and no one had any idea what to put on there. And baseball, it's like, wow, this is 3 hours of stuff I could put on the radio. I can fill up 3 hours. Awesome. Let's go do that. And that was just one of those catalysts that helped baseball really become America's pastime. It really wasn't before then. It became that in the 1920s.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things that I want to talk about this, because it's first of all, you kind of think about technology change. And, I even think about myself today. When I was a kid, you could watch cartoons on television, but they were only on certain times. And then you had to watch the commercials. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She doesn't know what a commercial is. She'll probably never know what a commercial is. And instead, she can watch whatever cartoon she wants to whenever she wants to watch it. And it's a great point about the radio, because it's true also when television comes on too, that it's like, no, there wasn't something on all the time. And baseball was perfect because it took up a big chunk of time. And that's helpful in that scenario because you can cover a lot and you can keep the radio on. You can keep people invested. But you're absolutely right when it comes to the commentary. I would challenge any of listeners at home, when next time you're watching a football game or a baseball game or something, put on mute. Put on mute for a couple minutes. Watch it. Experience is totally different. It's totally different when you don't have the commentary, when you don't have someone talking about it. Suddenly, it's not nearly as engaging as it was moments ago. And that's what people were kind of starting to figure out in the 20s too, was not just how can we package this in a way that works for people, right? But also in the 1920s, I have to talk about the Black Sox scandal because I just find it so fascinating. We're coming out of this fixed 1919 World Series. And when I teach it, I always, so we got the Reds versus the White Sox. The White Sox are like the big juggernaut team. The odds are astronomically in their favor to win this thing. And they come out and they lose games 1, 2, 3, and 4. And whenever I teach this to kids, they say, well, wait, isn't it over? And I say, no. In 1919, they extended it to 9 games. It's the only World Series where they decided, let's play a best of 9 games in this one. So you had to win 5, not 4. All right. And then after game 4, a lot of the guys, the White Sox, they're not getting these paychecks that they were supposed to get. Their bribe money didn't come through. So now it's like, well, I'm going to start playing. And so it ends up becoming a little bit closer in the end. And it's one of those history mysteries that we're still not 100% sure who fixed it, who was really in on the fix. Was Shoeless Joe Jackson in on it? There's arguments sort of back and forth. I love those. I love it when we don't know. That's why I like medieval and classical history, because it's like, well, we're not super sure why this Roman emperor did what he did, and we don't really know what happened in the 1919 World Series either. But also, if you're talking about like little explosions that change innovations, people might be interested to know that until the 1919 World Series, there was no commissioner of baseball. The commissioner of baseball position is created because of the scandal. Because there's this scandal, there's this need to say, okay, somebody's got to start to regulate this. We've got people cheating left and right. We need someone to come in and step in. And so it's again, and what I love about this era is people are not planning these things. They're not thinking like, oh, well, I'm going to create the automobile and that's going to help populate South Florida. No. These things are coming about. It's almost in stream of consciousness. Like, well, this is happening. We got to fix that and keep moving and so on and so forth. But we haven't talked about alcohol. Let's talk about alcohol, because you can't talk about the 1920s and not talk about the elephant in the room, which is Prohibition starts in 1920 as a result of an amendment that most people didn't want passed. and boy, does it backfire, right?
If there were one thing that would really catalyze, we talked a lot about cars, there's electricity and radio. Those are big themes and catalysts in the 1920s. But if you were to take one thing and say, what was the one thing that woke consumers up to their power and really retrained the American mindset, it was Prohibition. And for most of your listeners will kind of understand the broad brushes of Prohibition, but the fact of the matter, it was essentially the law of the land in the 1920s. and the number of unintended consequences, consumers, basically it showed the limits of what government could do, what government could mandate. It showed the limits of what, business could do and finance. It showed, it really, it created the consumer as a powerful actor on the stage. It's not that the consumer is more powerful than government or more powerful than business. That's not the case, but it really taught Americans what, that voting was one thing, but voting with your wallet is another. And essentially, Americans in the 1920s voted with their wallets that they wanted hooch, and they would do anything, really anything to get it. And the number of innovations that came out of that, the one that I detail in the book that I think is one of the most fascinating is the advent of the speedboat. Because during Prohibition, you could not have liquor. It started 3 miles offshore, and then it was extended later in the 1920s. It didn't matter. So essentially, these big barges of hooch, beer, whiskey, all those sort of things, either from the Caribbean or from Europe, wherever, would essentially park themselves 3 miles, anchor 3 miles offshore, and boats would run booze between those boats and the shore. That's kind of where the term rum runner comes from. It probably should be called rum sailor, because that's more of what they were. They weren't running anywhere. They were on boats. And, basically they had these little boats that would kind of outmaneuver the advent of the Coast Guard, which was woefully unprepared for what would happen. But the funniest thing is the Coast Guard decided, well, we need to be able to catch these boats. There's no way we can do it right now. We need to kind of create a speedboat, kind of a boat with an outboard motor. It's sleek. It can go fast. It's maneuverable. Well, in typical government fashion, they needed to publish their specifications for said boat, and they had to do a competitive bid, right? That's how government works. Well, what do you think the rum runners did? They went right back to those manufacturers and said, got it, I'll pay you more to build me a boat that's faster than that one. And that kind of cat and mouse, essentially created a boat that can do 100 knots on the water. Like, that's where they came from. Those are the very first speedboats. But, you think about, all of the different things that, it created, essentially there was always a organized crime in the United States to that point. That it kind of came over with the immigration waves. But, quite unexpectedly, in retrospect, in hindsight, it's perfectly obvious, but it wasn't obvious then that the mob would get involved in bootlegging, and bootlegging was ridiculously profitable, and people had, no real stigma about it. They were going to go drink. So they got involved in bootlegging. Well, bootlegging meant that they had to get involved in places where you could drink the bootlegged liquor. And they had to be nice places because there was lots of competition. So again, that competition led to much nicer and nicer clubs. Those clubs led to better and better performers, jazz performers, Louis Armstrong, and the explosion of jazz during that time was fueled very much by, Prohibition and illegal booze. As people there had to be a front for that, right? Kind of an entertainment front, and then you went into the back to get hammered, and then you'd come back out and listen to some great music. I mean, imagine listening to Louis Armstrong live at that time. Would jazz have happened without Prohibition? It's hard to say. It's hard to say whether that would have caught on in the way it did. And essentially everything we listen to in pop culture, all of our music today, is jazz derived. Rock and roll, hip hop, pop is all jazz derived today.
Yeah, it's really prohibition is one of those topics that it tends to get talked about a lot. You see it in popular culture, with the flappers and speakeasies and all of that sort of stuff. But I think it's a much more interesting topic than people give it credit for. And part of the reason is twofold. First of all, it is the triumph of the special interest over the majority. Prohibition, even going into when the amendment was passed, it never had popular support. They had a very powerful vocal temperance movement behind it that managed to get it through. Even against the wishes of most people in the country who wanted alcohol and wanted access to alcohol. But the reality is the rise of hard liquor, in the 19th century had caused a lot of problems. And it had caused a tremendous amount of problems and a lot of social unrest. And this was taking the sledgehammer to the gnat crawling on the ground. This was, we're just going to crush this thing. All right. And so it's fascinating to me, not only how it gets passed, but that it survives so long, because it becomes almost immediately apparent to anyone with half a brain that this has just created tremendous problems. This is all we did was create a bunch of additional problems. We didn't reduce the drinking at all. In fact, alcohol prices go down in some places. I mean, you're not paying taxes anymore. So it's one of the differences where we see this shift, and all we did was pour fertilizer on organized crime and create more organized crime. But yet it persists, and it persists long enough because people do make changes to their lives where they just decide to live with it. Now, the Prohibition Amendment doesn't allow for enforcement. That's something that, it's kind of like an asterisk that you always have to put on the subject. There's this thing that gets passed. It's called the Volstead Act. It's actually vetoed by the president, and then Congress overrides the veto. That sort of gives the IRS oddly enough, the jurisdiction to sort of prosecute all these things, which is, again, it's just one of these scenarios where you just have to wonder, like, what exactly were you guys thinking when you were trying to make this work? Because it becomes so immediately apparent that it's not going to function. And yet we go with it anyway. But it is one of those ways that sort of then transforms society, because then also what you do get is you get jazz and you get dancing, and you do get really for the first time in American history, you get women going to bars and going to speakeasies. Women didn't go to the saloon in the 19th century. That was for men only. You didn't go there. It wasn't culturally acceptable. That attitude starts to change in the 1920s in a really interesting way. And you talk about the innovation of the little black dress. So since that's the one part of the title that we haven't talked about, why don't we talk about it for a minute?
I think that most people, when we talk about how familiar it would be to take you back to the 1920s versus the 1880s. And gender roles is a fantastic way to think about that. And we would be much more familiar with modern gender roles in 1925 than we would be in 1915 for even that amount of time. You mentioned, just going to a speakeasy, kind of going to a bar. The advent of, kind of housing as a, kind of the single family home as the ideal, kind of the American ideal, and that the whole idea of kind of women having a place, having a domain in life where they are kind of primary and they are in charge of the household, they're in charge of the household budget, they're in charge of what products come in and out of the house. Was there still misogyny? Was there still, a number of those things? Yes, but it felt much more modern. And, the little black dress really typifies that. You still see women wearing Coco Chanel's dress today. more than 100 years later, you still see it. And you still see fashion really defined by that. And it's funny that the way I explain it to people is I say, go on Google Images and do a search for a crowd in New York, 1910, 1920 maybe. And then do a search on the crowd, 1928. And look at what you see. You see most of the men are kind of wearing the same things in each picture, but the women, all of a sudden you see different hairstyles, different dresses, different styles, just the variety, the colors, and not just on the wealthy people. We tend to think about like, well, wealthy people always had choices on what they could do. Well, sure, this is for everybody else. Everybody could afford, one of the things Coco Chanel was really focused on was one of her most famous quotes is, "I am for the women." And she made her clothes out of materials that were cheaper so that the average woman on the street could buy one. She, one of the materials was the material that men's breeches and underwear were made of. And she was proudly promiscuous in that era. She was obviously from France. But that kind of ethos moved over in terms of, what? There were a lot of single women in the cities, especially because it wasn't the farmer's son who left the farm because they inherited the farm. It was the farmer's daughter who left in many cases. So you had a lot of single women. A lot of single women were working. They needed practical fashions they could go to work in. And they wanted things that looked good, that were easy, that were cheap. And they wanted variety. This was the very first era of girls' night out. There was no girls' night out in 1915. In 1925, you had a girls' night out. It's just so fascinating. What was surprising to me in writing the chapters was how many innovations and how many chapters were driven by women. We think like, well, before the 1970s, before kind of the, second wave feminism, we didn't really have, there weren't women in the boardroom, and we talk about all of those things. Those things are legit. And then if we want to talk about women's suffrage in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s, we talk about that, but then we skip over that part. We skip over the passage of the suffrage amendment to basically 1970. And we kind of forget that, all of those kind of innovations in how you furnished a house, how you designed a home was female-led, female-designed. Advertising, in general, we've talked about advertising before, some of the best advertisers, because the products needed to be sold into the home was controlled by the woman as head of household, in terms of the budget. Well, many of the advertising copywriters were women because they had to be. They had to know that. When you start to think about all of those different impacts, and you'd think, okay, this is when we started to get the first idea that not just kind of women's suffrage, the ability to vote, but the ability to have real power, that women had real power in American society was catalyzed by the suffrage amendment. But it was driven home on a day-to-day level in the 1920s. That was fascinating to me in the book. And there's so many different, kind of plots and subplots in the book that reinforce that.
Yeah, and I think the power of the purse is something that we can't ignore when it comes to social capital in the United States. And of course, by the way, I should say it's not a coincidence that the Women's Suffrage Amendment is passed nearly simultaneous with the Prohibition Amendment, because, especially women were often the targets of domestic abuse that was driven by excessive alcohol consumption. And so the fact that they got the vote becomes instrumental in how that amendment is ultimately passed. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we do this all the time in history, and this is one of the problems with labels. was saying first wave feminism, second wave feminism, because then we've got like, well, women didn't do anything between 1920 and 1969. They bought pretty dresses, I think. We're not sure. They got their haircuts into bobs. That was about it. We're not really, that they didn't do anything other than that. They had to wait for Gloria Steinem to show up in 1970. And of course, that simplifies things to an unparalleled degree of ridiculousness. One of the other things that you point out there is so true, and it's true in every era of history. If you're going to look at economics, never, ever, 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 ever focus on the 1% wealthy. The 1% wealthy, they're always outliers. There's always an economy for luxury good for the 1%. There was one in the Middle Ages too. It's not any different. And you got to get rid of that because you don't see large-scale changes. What happens in the 19-teens and 1920s is this change in mentality of we're not just going to sell to the 1% anymore. We're not just going to sell to the Rockefellers anymore. They can buy as many cars as they want to. It doesn't really particularly matter. By the way, it's really interesting if you go back, this is a total aside, but if you go back and you look at like the top 100 wealthiest people in the United States, in like 1910 or 1920, it's like 30 of them are Rockefellers. Like it's just kind of insane how much wealth is sort of pushed onto this one particular family. And of course, this is the same era when we get the income tax too, and I didn't really talk about that, but that's another innovation that starts to change how wealth distribution is going to occur in the country. All right, well, we're at an hour, but I want to ask, is there anything that we haven't talked about that we should talk about?
I think the biggest thing that we can leave listeners with is really thinking about, the 1920s as the choice era. When consumers needed to, when the average American needed to learn about how to make choices, just think about the mindset shift in a very controlled life before the 1920s and the amount of options that you had available to you that really came about in the 1920s, that think about the shift, not just in mindset, but think about how jarring that would have been to live through. And it is almost impossible. It's when people talk about like, well, what was the life like before the internet? Yes, I mean, you can, there's a certain kind of transition that went through that helps teach people about that, but it was really nothing compared to that transition of all the different aspects of your life in the 1920s. And what was interesting to me about that was how jarring it was, and how that was the first time that you really got what we would call a child-centric sort of society and a youth-centric culture. Before then, it was not that. It was, much more of a traditional society in which, age was venerated. And you get to the 1920s, and children were the first people who really kind of caught on and understood what was going on. And they were taking control. In the 1930s, you see the advent of the teenager. No one had used that word really before to describe a cohort of people. It was the first time you got that. So when you think about like when the amount of shift that occurred during that time was so intense, I think that alone is really worthy of deeper study, certainly at the collegiate level. I would argue also at the high school level, they probably understand it better than, you and I do, Adam. I kind of get what's happening here, and I think they'd be able to understand that mindset shift better than we would. They certainly did then, and I think it's one of the most underreported things. If there's anything in history we don't really talk about, we also don't talk about kids. We talk about mostly political leaders, military leaders, maybe major cultural figures, but we never talk about kids. Kids are like kind of this sidebar sort of thing. that happens. They drove consumer culture, especially in the late 1920s, and they kept it going during the 1930s when we don't talk about them at all. We talk about depression and we talk about all these things. We do not talk about how the kids that grew up during the 1920s didn't all of a sudden kind of go back to 1880 in the 1930s. They were the teenagers. They essentially created kind of a new culture, inside the Great Depression. We don't talk about that at all. But I will in the next book.
I think that young people are an interesting topic. And it is fascinating to me that children simply aren't talked about at all until really after this era. And I mean that almost full stop, period. And I mean it for the big people in history too. Like, you have to really pick and choose to find someone. I think if you go back to classical history, really the only person in classical history who has even an apocryphal story about when they were children is Alexander the Great. And he's really the exception to a lot of rules. So apart from him and his story about Bucephalus, we don't really know about anybody. We don't know about Caesar Augustus. We don't know about Julius Caesar. We don't know about Cleopatra. We don't know about Eleanor of Aquitaine. We don't know about any of these people. Henry VIII, we don't really know anything about. He was there, but there's just no focus on them. And I'm just going to add on one thing to what you were talking about there at the end, because in addition with sort of the new emphasis on children, the other thing I would point out to listeners that's really starts to change in the 1920s is education. Education really starts to change in the 1920s. Up until then, children's education in 1910 would have looked a lot like it did in 1850. It would have been a lot of rote memorization. There would have been a lot of cutting of switches and the use of switches in class for students not particularly paying attention. That doesn't go away completely in the 1920s, but there's a change, and a lot of it is, of course, also driven by the economy, because now we need accountants. We need a lot of accountants. We need a lot of secretaries. We need typists for the first time. So we need, and to an extent, I would argue as an educator, we haven't changed education much since 1930. Now we need sort of a new reset in terms of what we need, because maybe we don't need quite so many typists anymore. Maybe we don't need, with AI, quite so many middle management people anymore. That's a subject for another day. As you said, that will be for the next book, or the fifth book, or the sixth book, or the seventh book. I'm not sure. We'll get there. We'll get there. Everybody be patient, okay? It takes time to write these things. We'll get there, all right? 1 decade at a time, folks. But, all right, well, this has been just fantastic, as was last time, and as will be next time. Thanks so much for coming on. I know we were all over the board, but I think we really got, we got into the meat of sort of the connectivity of this era. And I think it's just really important, and I'm glad we got it across to people to understand how much the 1920s really does still affect us today. It's just really, really appreciate having you on.
No, thank you very much. I think the interview style matches the book's style. Very much a chapter by chapter sort of approach to this. So it's easy to pick up and put down. I wrote it in a way so if you were on the gym, on the treadmill for 30 minutes, you could either listen to a chapter or read a chapter. That's kind of what it's designed for. So it is a book written about consumer culture in a way that consumers would appreciate. Thematically on point, we'll put it that way. Thank you, Adam, for having me on. It's always a pleasure.